Good morning. My name is Paddy Nixon. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra, and I'm here this morning on Zoom from lockdown to have a conversation with Michelle Grattan on a week in politics. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Paddy.
Look, so I think we can start with the news that's really been dominating this week, which is from the capital in Afghanistan, from Kabul, have been seized by the Taliban. It's been a shockingly swift course of action, hasn't it, since people began to withdraw with the US withdrawal. It really seems like the future of the Afghan people is really up in the air. And quite clearly, everybody at the moment suspects that the Taliban will be staging reprisals for those that have been supporting the West over the last 20 years. And as we're watching those quite tragic events unfold in Afghanistan, Australia, and the Australian government, I should say, has been turning its attention to evacuating Australians and some Afghans who previously assisted the forces. But despite this, the government hasn't been as generous in its refugee programs as other nations historically. And firstly, Michelle, do we know what will happen to Afghans living in Australia on temporary protection visas?
Scott Morrison was very, very strong this week, and he said that there would be no change in their status, that he didn't want to send any messages to people smugglers for people to get on boats. And so these people who have been here for years and years, because after all the boat stopped a long time ago, and anyway at the end people were being sent offshore, they've really settled into Australian life, and it does seem really unfair to deny them the security that being on permanent residence would provide them. Of course, the government says that there's no intention to send them back, but it leaves the qualification at this stage. But in fact, they will never be sent back unless the Taliban government fell. And I think that the chances of this restarting the people smuggler trade are pretty low if you gave them permanent residency. And we have shown in the past that we can turn back boats if necessary. So the government's being pretty hard line on this, I think. And it has, I gather, directly said to Afghan community leaders, tell your people, don't get on boats.
Which is a pretty hard line, as you say, and clearly carrying on the very strong line that the government's taken across all these issues of immigration and temporary residency here in the country.
That's right. And it's interesting that Anthony Albanese said during the week that those on temporary protection visas should, in fact, be made permanent citizens. No, so whether the government over the coming months in the run-up to the election tries to wedge Labor on that issue remains to be seen, but I think it's possible.
And very much on that line, Defence Minister Peter Dutton has said that the strict security considerations have to be taken into account in relocating Afghans into Australia, because some Afghans who worked with the Australians may have shifted allegiances, to use his phrase. Do you think this goes in the face of Australia's moral obligation to help Afghan people?
I think there are a couple of issues here. Obviously, there have to be tight security checks, but it's really impossible to absolutely guarantee that no one slips through who possibly sometime in the future could be a threat. You just never have that sort of ability to be totally sure. I think you have to accept that while being cautious. But on the wider question of generosity, the fact that Australia has been rather slow in processing these people and now getting them out of Afghanistan, that's the helpers, has meant that some who should be coming to Australia because of what they did for this country and the assistance they provided to our forces just won't get here. There won't be time. There won't be the opportunity to get them to Kabul to get on any flights. On the general question of refugees, the government has said we'll take at least 3,000 and said it expected more. That was its first position when it said they would be within the existing refugee quota. So that would mean that fewer people would come from elsewhere, obviously. Yesterday, the Prime Minister suggested that the broader refugee quota might actually be increased if this was necessary to accommodate extra people who are Afghan refugees. He was pretty vague, so I'm not sure whether this actually means something hard and fast or whether this was just a line on the day.
And the other thing, I guess, to reflect on is that this is now 20 years of this conflict, and it's coming to an end, well, at least in the context of Allied forces being taken out. What do you think will be the legacy of the Afghan war?
This is obviously being debated by commentators and also by some veterans who served in Afghanistan. And I think there's quite a lot of disillusionment among some of those people about, well, what was that all about? Clearly, the forces did some good, the various Allied forces, while they were there. A generation of women and girls got a much better life. Girls got an education. But where the big failure was in training the Afghan military so that it was able to take care of security in the country. Another failure, obviously, was in getting a government that had the will and determination to hold its nerve to run an effective democratic system. The corruption in the country undermined institutions and trust in the government. And I think that all these things contributed to the fact that the Taliban had the determination, had the will for the long game, and in the end simply prevailed because the forces on the other side, the local forces, whether political or military, did not match it in terms of determination to preserve what had been achieved by the initial invasion and the presence of the Allied forces.
Yeah, I think we and historians will be debating this one for quite a time to come. And I think one of the issues that is likely to come out is the impact it's had on people's lives, and particularly, as you point out, whether they revert and the rights of women and children, particularly young girls, to education disappears again. And there's going to be some really challenging visuals, I suspect, over the next period of time.
Well, we know that they're saying things will be somewhat different, but I don't think anybody seriously believes that who's watched the history of the Taliban over any time, and certainly some of the reports of their initial actions, telling women to go home, violence against various people, those initial actions belie the softer words that were coming earlier.
Yeah, I hope the images we see aren't as confronting as I expect they will be. And then, of course, we can't have one of these conversations at the moment without talking about COVID. On the COVID front, we've seen outbreaks and lockdowns throughout regional New South Wales. Obviously, the massive increases in Sydney. ACT's now added to the list. One of the concerns is the spread of virus in the Aboriginal communities, and particularly how they're faring. Do you think these communities could have been better insulated against the virus?
I think absolutely more should have been done earlier. The level of vaccination this week, up till this week, has been lower in the Western New South Wales Indigenous community than generally, and overall nationally that's the case. The Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, was saying, well, he was proud that there was the level that existed, but in fact it was pretty second rate. And I think that the government's sending in this week Defence vaccination teams and other assistance to the communities was just another example of too little too late. If those teams could go in now, they could have gone in weeks ago and done the vaccinations when the whole program started, and that's what should have happened.
And then, of course, in this COVID world, obviously vaccinations, you just said, is a key issue. We're now getting to the point where organizations like QANTAS came out this week saying it's going to require its pilots and cabin crew and airport staff to be fully vaccinated. And I think Mr. Alan Joyce was quite direct. It was either be vaccinated or don't work for this company. Do you think the businesses will put similar obligations on their staff? And I'm sure it will be a debate as well, and whether they're allowed to.
I think some will. The government has so far made it clear that it's very much a matter for businesses, and that it's not going to get involved in this in any way of legislating to give them protection. I think Qantas had a vote, and if they want to, if businesses want to impose compulsion, then obviously that's a sensible way to go. But in some cases, I think this will be quite divisive within businesses, and that other alternatives are probably a better resort. For example, the vaccine passport, which the government doesn't like to call a passport, but evidence that you've been vaccinated, and using that to have access to various things like sporting functions or entertainment or restaurants or whatever. That would put a lot of pressure on people to get vaccinated, and is a bit less controversial than saying, well, you're going to be fired if you don't get vaccinated. But also we're quite a long way from really the hard line anti-vaxxers being a problem, or the people who won't take the vaccine, because the challenge at the moment is to get it to those who are quite willing but have found it hard. Now, this week it's been opened up to the younger cohorts, and that's highly desirable because they're the ones who are transmitting it at a high rate. And I think that there's still this challenge of making it easy and available to people who are very willing to get the jab. Yeah.
Well, I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And obviously, despite what our Prime Minister might have said, it definitely is a race to now for us all to get vaccinated. And hopefully all those that want to get vaccinated can get vaccinated as soon as possible. As always, Michelle, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I look forward to speaking to you again.
And hopefully face-to-face before too long, Paddy. Goodbye for now.
Yeah, face-to-face is really what I'd rather put as well. So I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Thank you.